Okay, folks, it's 1:45, and so in an effort to stay on time, I guess we'll start here. I'm very happy today to introduce Paula Antunes and Derickx, because I've been working with them for years on the St. Mary's River Remedial Action Plan and through the Binational Public Advisory Council for the St. Mary's River. And both Paula and Lisa have been very integral in the BPAC and in the RAP for the last 10 years or so. But Paula is going to start off talking about the cleanup and status of the St. Mary's River. And Paula is a senior research scientist with AquaTox testing in Canada, and she's also adjunct faculty at Algoma University. And we're very happy to have Algoma University working with the RAP for many years. Lake State was the only university working with the RAP, and we were able to get Algoma University working with us as well. And Lisa Derickx is also going to talk. And Lisa has a degree, bachelor's degree from Carleton University in Canada, and she's worked for various environmental organizations in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, including Corridors for Life, Testmark Laboratories, Natural Resources Canada, the Invasive Species Research Institute, Sault College, and Algoma University. And Lisa is the current RAP coordinator for Ontario, and she does most of our work for BPAC, which is wonderful, and we really appreciate it. And Paula was also the former chairperson for the BPAC. So, pardon?
Lisa's going to speak first.
Okay, so Lisa, I'm going to take it over.
Well, thank you so much for having us here to talk about this today. So as Mike said, we're going to talk about the cleanup and current status of the St. Mary's River. So just to start off with a few fun facts about the St. Mary's River. Its entire length is approximately 112 kilometers, or just under 75 miles. And it is an international border between Michigan and Ontario. And please, if you guys can't hear me at the back, just kind of wave your hands, because I don't have a very loud voice.
You have a microphone too if you want.
I'm just nervous, so I'm going to try this first.
Okay.
All right, so the twin cities of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and Michigan are connected by an international border. The first modern lock was constructed in 1855, known as the American Lock. And today there are 4 parallel locks on the American side, and 2 are regularly used. And then there's a small lock in Ontario, Canada. Okay, so the Canadian lock is used mainly for recreational and tour boats, whereas mainland shipping traffic uses the American lock. The 2 locks were made part of the Great Lakes waterway, which is a system of natural channels and canals which enables navigation amongst North American Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes are naturally connected. However, historically there's been obstacles that have prevented large ship navigation. So some examples would include Niagara Falls and the St. Mary's River Rapids. In Canada, the St. Mary's River is designated as a Canadian Heritage River. So the Canadian Heritage River system gives national recognition to some of our outstanding rivers, and it encourages long-term management of these areas. So since the 1800s, the river has been modified significantly. And this is to accommodate urban development, ship navigation, vehicle and rail transportation, as well as to provide for hydroelectric power. And for over 100 years, municipal waterworks and a number of industries have operated alongside the river. So for example, we've heard a lot about today the tannery, the manufactured gas plant on the American side, and then on the Canadian side, the pulp and paper mill and the steel plant. So before I start talking about some of the environmental impairments associated with the St. Mary's River, I always like to talk about a different river, so the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. This is a river that journeys into Lake Erie. And this river has been known as one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. So back in the days, it was common practice to dump pretty much everything into the river. And at one point, it was noted that the oil spill on the river was 6 inches thick, which is kind of a crazy statistic. This river has actually caught on fire approximately 13 times. One of the biggest fires was in 1952. It caused about $1 million in damages to boats, shoreline properties, and a bridge. And then another fire in the 1960s. There was an article in Times Magazine about this fire, and that's kind of what got the nation thinking about water quality issues and the fact that, wow, a river actually caught on fire. So it helps spur along the movement for better water quality control legislation. I'm not forgetting anything. So this resulted in things such as the Clean Water Act in Ontario, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and helped organize the Environmental Protection Agency. So Canada and the United States share a long history of cooperation on water quality or water-related environmental issues. And this goes back to the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. And what that treaty did was it established the International Joint Commission, which is an institutional mechanism for, I guess, cooperative problem solving when it comes to water-related issues. The IJC, so the International Joint Commission, uses a comprehensive ecosystem approach. So they look at everything that's interrelated, such as land, water, air, living things, including humans, and it involves all stakeholders in the process when it comes to management. One of the best examples of one of these practical applications from the IJC is the Remedial Action Plan program for the Great Lakes. So this concept originated from the International Joint Commission Board, and the board found that despite all the new regulations that were coming into play, a number of beneficial uses or environmental impairments weren't being restored. So they wanted to have some kind of a plan to implement to help restore those impairments. Just go back to talk about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So this is an agreement between Canada and the United States. And within this agreement, it designates 43 areas of concern in the Great Lakes Basin. So an area of concern is an area where the environment has been degraded to a point where it has affected our beneficial uses of the area or enjoyment of the area, as well as overall ecosystem health. So the map here shows you there are 43 areas of concern in the Great Lakes Basin, 26 American areas of concern, 12 Canadian, and 5 Binational. Actually, I should update that because 3 of the Canadian locations have been remediated, so they've been removed from the list of AOCs. 2 Canadian ones are in a state of natural recovery, so they haven't been listed yet. We're just waiting on the environment to essentially heal itself. And on the U.S. side, 4 locations have been removed. So, and the St. Mary's River is an example of a binational area of concern. This picture just shows you the red line is the area of concern. So essentially from the mouth of Lake Superior, and then it kind of goes halfway around St. Joseph Island. And why is the St. Mary's River an area of concern? Basically, it's from historical pollution from industries, partially treated municipal sewage, untreated stormwater runoff, as well as physical alterations to the shoreline. So when the OC program began in the 1980s, the river suffered episodes of oil slicks. There was lots of oily fibrous material, as well as reports about foul odor. So that led to poor aesthetics in the area. There was reports of algal blooms, especially downstream of the East End wastewater treatment plant in Ontario, before it was upgraded in 2006. As well as that plant was a source of bacteria, so there was high levels of E. coli in the water. Due to a lot of wastewater from industries, we are now dealing with contaminated sediment issues. Contaminants in fish were elevated, as well as we've seen tumors in some fish species. And there was degraded fish habitat and loss of rapid habitat along the river. So each of those 43 areas of concern in the Great Lakes Basin has a remedial action plan. So this describes the nature, extent, and causes of the environmental problems, and then recommends actions to restore and protect those environments. Essentially, these plans are 3-stage plans. So the first stage is to identify the problems in the area. The second stage is to carry out restoration activities. And then the third stage is to confirm that all those actions have had an effect, a positive effect on the environment. So for stage 1 of the Remedial Action Plan for the St. Mary's River, we have a stage 1 report where all of those environmental impairments were described. So for each of the 43 areas of concern, there are 14 different impaired environmental features, what we like to call beneficial use impairments. So of the 14 possible ones, St. Mary's River had 10. So for example, there's restrictions on fish consumption due to high contaminants. There was degradation of fish and benthic populations, as I stated before, fish tumors and other deformities. Bird and animal deformities and reproductive problems were of concern. There was algal blooms, so eutrophication and undesirable algae. There was beach closings due to high E. coli content. Degradation of aesthetics due to the oil slicks and the foul smell. There was loss of fish and wildlife habitat, and then restriction on dredging activities due to the contaminated sediments. So we're currently in the stage 2 process for the St. Mary's River. In 2002, a stage 2 report was published, which outlines over 50 remedial actions and monitoring initiatives that are needed to address the previous problems that I just talked about. And in order to, address these problems and make sure that what we're doing is actually making a difference, each environmental impairment, or VUI, has a set of delisting criteria. So these delisting criteria are measurable targets that we want to achieve so that we know that we're restoring those impairments in the river. And they essentially establish a benchmark for when a beneficial use can be deemed no longer impaired. So we want to get rid of those environmental impairments from the list before the entire AOC can be delisted. And they follow a SMART test, so they have to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-oriented. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of the milestones that we've achieved for the St. Mary's River. So back in 1991, this steel plant on the Canadian side commissioned a main filtration plant for wastewater that was being discharged. In 1995, the pulp and paper mill installed an activated sludge secondary treatment facility. So these two industries are trying to, I guess, better themselves and what they were doing to the environment. 1997, the St. Mary's River Fishery Task Group was established to help coordinate fisheries assessments between Canada and the United States. From 97 to 99, the seal mill invested in new technology to help reduce their phenol concentrations, as well as to optimize their water reuse by 90%. In 2003, the City of Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario constructed a sanitary sewer overflow tank at Bellevue Park to help address infiltration and high flow events. And then in 2006, the City of Ontario upgraded their East End wastewater treatment plant. They upgraded it to secondary treatment, and it uses a biological nutrient removal system, which was kind of a cool thing because it was the first in Canada. 2007, we see the cleanup of the Cannery Bay Great Lakes Legacy Act site, and that helped to remove some of the mercury and chromium from the river sediment. In 2010, a report was finalized by the Sugar Island Monitoring Work Group to confirm that floating solids and E. coli bacteria were due to natural causes and stormwater outflows mainly. In 2010, we see the cleanup of the consumer energy manufactured gas plant site. So they removed 26,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment from that site. From 2013 to 2015, Algoma University undertook a water quality study looking at the physical and chemical parameters and ultimately showing that the aesthetics and eutrophication and undesirable algae impairments within the river could no longer be seen as impaired because there's been there's been a huge benefit, and actually Paula's going to talk a little bit more about that study in a few minutes. The City of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario established some new stormwater management master plan and guidelines to help deal with stormwater runoff in 2015. From 2011 to 2016, we did a beach closing assessment to show that the water quality and state of beaches within the AOC were similar to those outside of the AOC. So just recently, 2017, the Little Rapids Restoration Project was completed. This was a big thing. They reestablished flow to the rapids for the first time in more than 50 years. And then the City of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan is currently doing a combined sewer system separation. So the deadline for that is in December 2018 for completion.
Who's driving that?
The City of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan.
But is the EPA or what governmental agency?
Well, the problem is there was sewage overflows during times of high rain. So that's a violation of the Clean Water Act.
Okay.
But virtually every municipality has either had to separate their sewers or make retention basins to control the rate of flow into their wastewater treatment to deal with it.
So as I stated, we're currently in the second stage of the new action plan, but for the third stage, once all of those 50 plus remedial actions have been completed and the criteria for restoring those beneficial uses have been met, then we could potentially say that the AOC could be delisted. This obviously depends on scientific evidence to prove that what we've been doing has been effective, as well as public and stakeholder consensus. And then at that time, a stage 3 draft report will be created that encompasses all that information. So I'm going to hand it over to Paula to talk about some of the studies.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, thanks for everyone for coming and staying into these later sessions. So this is the ultimate question. Have these actions been effective? We've done so much work and it's been such a long road to recovery. I'd like to keep you in suspense for just a couple minutes and touch on, again, a couple of the things that Lisa just spoke about, because they're so important in terms of our journey to recovery in the St. Mary's River. And one was the cleanup of the Tannery Bay that Dr. Greg Zimmerman spoke of this morning. And again, if somebody can't hear me, just wave your hands and I'll either speak louder or get the mic. So the Northwestern Leather Company operated between the 1900s and 1958. And during those years of operation, they released a huge amount of arsenic, cadmium, chromium, lead, and mercury into the water. So in 2006, there was a second round of sediment cleanup that was undertaken both in the bay here and the surrounding wetland. And in that cleanup, there was 1 million pounds of chromium removed and also 70 pounds of mercury. I do toxicology experiments, and mostly with water, not with sediment, and they're lab-based, mind you, but we order 500-gram bottles of metals at a time. So I had to even go back a few times just to make sure I was reading that 1 million pounds right. That's a lot of chromium. And I have to say that Greg was talking about local operations and his concern over environmental pollution if those kinds of operations came back. Of course, you can't help the smell of tannery operations. I don't think any way to avoid that, but I think historically, First Nations especially, they had special ways of tanning hides that include using the brains of animals, and I think it was urinating on the hides as well, if I'm not mistaken. So there are some more natural ways that don't use the nasties of these heavy metals, which, you know, each one of these metals alone are highly toxic. So you can't imagine what kind of biological effects you'd have from the combination of those metal mixtures. The other was the Consumers Energy Manufacturing Gas Plant. That cleanup was done in 2011, and there were 26,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment removed in that cleanup operation. And this one was different from Tannery Bay because unlike heavy metals, which undoubtedly, yes?
I just wanted to mention, someone else mentioned they removed 35,000 cubic yards. I think it was Greg in the morning.
Right.
Well, I did some quick calculations this morning. We take these 3 brooms and measure them cubically. I think they're about 320 cubic yards.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of what 35 or 26,000 are like, because we have trouble visualizing our large numbers, but you start putting in perspective, I think that helps.
That's right. Those are hard numbers to envision, for sure. Thank you for that. So these sediments here were contaminated with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And so PAHs, they're ubiquitous in the environment. They're found naturally in things like creosote, oil, and tar. But unfortunately, many of those PAHs are associated with cancer in both aquatic life and in humans. So not something that you want in a waterway, but again, unfortunately, they are an important part of industrial processes, and they're needed for those processes to be undertaken. And as Lisa also mentioned, there were several initiatives done by the City of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, SR Steel Algoma, and the St. Mary's Paper Company before they were decommissioned in 2012 to reduce the amount of contaminants in their effluent. So remember that, so the City of Sault Ste. Marie had up to 89% reduction in biochemical oxygen demand, suspended solids, and phosphorus levels. For SR Steel Algoma, it was oil and grease, suspended solids, phenol, and ammonia. And for St. Mary's Paper was BOD, suspended solids, and phenols. And of course, that 91% has gone to 100 because they're no longer here. But just keep in mind that these are that much reduction on a minute basis, hourly basis, daily basis for the lifetime of these industries and municipalities that are operating. So cumulatively, that's a big reduction for the St. Mary's River. So back to the question, have these actions been effective? Well, a number of studies have been done over the past several years to specifically answer this question. And over the next several slides, I'm just going to give you a very high-level overview of those studies and what their major research findings were. So one was the benthic community structure study that was done by Environment Canada in 2002. So they looked at organisms that were in the sediment of the St. Mary's River and at the sediment-water interface at many different sampling locations along the Canadian side of the AOC, 31 locations in total. And the good news of that study was that there was no strong evidence of benthic community impairment. So Dr. Murky, you spoke about this a little bit earlier in your talk about the importance of community structure studies. And just to put that into a little bit of perspective from a chemical view, you have obviously in the St. Mary's River, you've got a mixed bag of contaminants from various sources of industrial and activity in municipal effluents over many years. So it's really a mixed bag of contaminants. And sometimes you can have a combination of contaminants, and they're there, and you know that they're at elevated concentrations that could be toxic, but they may not be. Because sometimes you have the metals, for example, they may have exceeded solubility limits, and so what happens is they precipitate out, and they're found in chunks on the bottom, basically, and the organisms are moving around it. They're too big to be eaten, or they're not of interest to that organism to eat. And so you actually find that the organisms are safe and healthy. Whereas on the contrary, you could have those same or a different mix of chemicals, and they're actually more toxic in that specific combination than they would be if you had those chemicals individually. So community structure studies really tell you what that mix of contaminants occurring together is doing to that the biota in the area. And so if you have a highly polluted environment, you could find a scenario where there's no organisms at all. Or, as Dr. Murky mentioned earlier, you could find only organisms belonging to species that are known to be pollution tolerant. So the types of species you find are kind of important. It wasn't all good news in this study. There were PAHs that were found to be present in concentrations that exceeded the sediment guideline lowest effect level at all sites. So lowest effect levels are levels where you know that there is contamination present, but the level of contamination is such that you would expect that the majority of species would still be able to survive there. And concentrations of metals, mostly iron, but not limited to iron, were also elevated at some sites. In the sediment toxicity tests that were done in the same study, using sediments collected from the 31 locations, biological effects to midges and mayflies were only noted for samples collected from the area within Bellevue Marine Park. So that's the area that's circled here. And this is the first depositional zone on the Canadian side downstream from industry. And so where you have depositional zones, that's where the water's starting to slow down. You have the suspended particulates that are starting to fall out and settle on the bottom. And organic matter is this natural, amazing material that it acts like a sponge for contaminants. In natural systems, it's really good because it binds the nutrients and makes it a better environment for the organisms because there's more nutrients there. But unfortunately, when you have contaminants, it behaves the same way and it collects them all. So it's not surprising that you see toxicity in these areas. A follow-up study to that one was done in 2011, also on the Canadian side. And in that study, the depositional zone downstream, this is the Bellevue Marine Park area. This is downstream area east of Topsail Island was the focus of the investigation. The purpose of that study was to find out how deep the sediment was, what kind of quality of sediment it was there, whether it was more clay or whether it was fine particulate matter, and also to establish profiles of contaminants with depth. And this study, you can't tell by these pictures, but it was actually done in December. So you can imagine there were some technical challenges and it was freezing cold out on the water. This was a picture that was actually taken of one of the samples for the study. This is a split spoon core. And you can see the sample. This is the sediment actually coming out at the bottom here. It was highly fluid and fine in nature. So that made it extremely challenging to retain those sediment samples within those coring devices. And what happened was, even though there were adaptations made to the ends here, there were sand traps and other things put on to try and keep that in. As they were lifted out of the water, all the sample was falling out the bottom. And then when you got into the heavier clay material, kind of the opposite was happening. It was so heavy that the gravitational push on that mass was just pushing it out the bottom. So unfortunately, there were no samples collected to test for environmental contaminants. But you can see, for example, in this picture here, there is an organic sheen on the water. And there's one sample in particular that had a very strong odor of organic contaminants. So even though there was no chemistry collected, one of the good things was there was no evidence of wood chips or any other foreign material found in these samples, or the little bits that were collected. And that was important because in previous studies, those kinds of observations were noted. And I remember somebody speaking this morning about the fact that there was sawdust and other materials deposited into the river. And sawdust acts a lot like organic material in the sense that it binds nutrients as well. So as you have that material breaking down, you also have the release of some contaminants. But it's good that it shows that the system is naturally undergoing biological degradation and recovery. So I partner projects, and I should mention that the sediment was found to be up to 5.3 meters thick, and mostly it was particulate fines like you see here coming out the bottom, so very, very fine fluid sediment. So a partner study by Environment Canada is currently underway, and the report's due actually this fall. And the objective of that study is to look at the rate of new sediment deposition. So if this area was to be left for natural recovery, it is one of the management options being considered at the moment, in part because it would be very difficult to dredge this material because it is so fine. How long would it take for clean, new, fresh sediment to be deposited to a layer that you would consider that it's a healthy, thick cap on top? So that study is expected in May now, the study report. In 2011, Dr. Barbara Keller at LSSU and her colleagues also published a study on the St. Mary's River sediment quality. They assessed sediment samples that were collected between 2003 and 2005 on the U.S. side of the AOC and extending to the north of Sugar Island and around. The results from their assessment showed that while there were slightly elevated concentrations of chromium, nickel, and copper in superficial sediments at some sites, the concentrations were overall declining when contrasted with the results of a 1985 study that showed quantification of those same metals at those same sites. And overall, they were found to be similar to levels in Lake Superior, Whitefish Bay, and to reference locations within the St. Mary's River. So overall, the research leads of the study found that sediment conditions in much of the river were no longer a problem. In 2014 and 2015, so getting a little bit more recent, contractors for the Army Corps of Engineers dredged sections of the navigation channel. There were 30 sites in the St. Mary's River that were sampled and assessed for chemical contaminant levels. And this was not done for the purpose of pure and applied research. It was done because they needed to dredge the channel first to ensure the safe movement of vessels through it. And they needed to know what kind of guidelines they had to follow for disposal of the dredged sediment. But nonetheless, it's still great for us because we get to see what the results of that analysis was. So they looked at semi-volatile organic compounds, PAHs, PCBs, and organochlorine pesticides. And I did peruse through the report, and if I recall correctly, everything for organochlorine pesticides, PCBs, and PHs were below detection limits. There may have been a couple samples that I missed, but everything I looked at was below detect. And that wasn't true for metals. There were several instances where the metals were elevated above the lowest detect levels, but nothing that was looked like it would have been very toxic to aquatic life, and again, indicative of a system that is undergoing natural recovery. So from a sediment disposal perspective, the sediments were found to be below generic residential soil direct contact criteria, and they were able to dispose of the sediment as per normal uncontaminated sediment guidelines. Now looking at water quality, a comprehensive 3-year study conducted by Algoma University of water quality across 5 different monitoring sites found no algal blooms or high concentrations of macroscopic algae or microscopic algae at any of the sites. And the majority of the nutrients measured fell below the recommended guidelines for typical levels found within either oligotrophic or mesotrophic waters. So that was really good because if you found eutrophic conditions in the St. Mary's River where you've got the input is from oligotrophic water, Lake Superior, you know that there's anthropogenic inputs and there's something wrong there. So overall, the study was fantastic and showed that with respect to a nutrient outlook, that the waters were in very good condition. So I'm not going to go through all the parameters that were looked at in that study. We'll just touch on a couple briefly. Phosphorus, as you know, is an essential element for plant life, but it can cause eutrophication and promote significant algal growth. And it can decrease the levels of dissolved oxygen to the extent that it's harmful to aquatic life and fish. Did you see there was a multi-year study? Oh no. Okay, now I don't know how to use pointer for this. Okay. See if I can do that again. So there were 3 sampling years, 2013, 2014, and 2015 at several sampling sites. The provincial water quality guideline is 0.03 milligrams per liter. And you can see on the y-axis, that's not even on the scale here. So everything that was measured was very low, below the provincial water quality guideline, and the highest was for Echo Bay, which is 0.02, and that is an area that is impacted by agricultural runoff. So not surprising that the phosphorus was a little bit higher there. There's also a lot of boating activity and healthy shoreline vegetation, so a lot of good nutrients there as well for natural reasons. For nitrogen, similar story. It's similar to phosphorus in that the nitrogen-phosphorus ratios can cause problems with algal blooms. And in terms of nitrates, there is a risk to human infants for nitrate exposure. But compared to the Canadian Council Minister's Environment Guidelines for the protection of aquatic life in freshwaters, that's 1.5 milligrams per liter, and you can see on the y-axis here again, it's not even on the scale. So unlike phosphorus, all the sites were fairly similar, but again, the highest was 0.85, so well below the water quality guideline value. And the water looked perfectly nice and clear. It was good in all locations that were sampled. There was no evidence of unnatural color, odor, or turbidity, and no problems with degraded aesthetics. So a separate multi-year beach and water quality assessment found no local human sources of bacterial contamination. And that report, Lisa, is just out now, isn't it, right? For internal review at least? Yeah. So stay tuned for the results of that one. So we talked about community structure studies before being important. So the thing about community structure studies is they can tell you, if all the species, even from sensitive species types are found, an organism might be able to survive somewhere, but it doesn't mean that they're absolutely feeling well and healthy. So instead of putting a fish tumor, actual fish tumor, I found this cartoon because my kids were here today, and they'd be grossed out if I showed anything else. Sorry, I removed that picture. So this actually says, okay, yeah, maybe a species is present, but how is it actually doing? Is it actually sick, even though it's living there from the contaminants that are present? So the Department of Fisheries and Oceans have been studying tumor rates in white suckers found within the AOC. In 1985 to 1990, they found a 9.2% liver tumor rate. In 2009, it was 10.6%, and in 2015, it was 6%. So unfortunately, in the 2015 study, there was only 100 fish collected, as opposed to the higher numbers collected in previous years. But nonetheless, it does indicate that things are recovering. It would be nice to see another year of sampling to verify that trend, that is actually a trend. So the 6% tumor rate measured in 2015 is closer to the Canadian delisting criteria for the beneficial use impairment, which states that the BUI will no longer be impaired when a survey from the AOC of a locally abundant member of the sucker family encompassing a diverse age range indicates a liver prevalence rate of less than 5%. So we're almost there. And hopefully that wasn't an anomaly, that it was only 6% and not higher. And that study as well is expected out anytime, the study report, right, Lisa? It's expected out this fall? Yes. So where are we now? It's been a long journey. And like the Cuyahoga River, the St. Mary's River continues to undergo a lengthy process of recovery. The progress has been largely attributed to the introduction of environmental legislation, industrial municipal operating standards, science-based research, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and citizens groups like BPAC providing valuable input and oversight. I really like this cartoon. It's just a cartoon, but it says so much. Because literally, as Dr. Payment was talking about the prophecy about the rivers being on fire, you go from the stage here where you can actually see visual impairments. If you see that the water is really unhealthy, well, in this case, it's on fire, right? But you could, even without it being on fire, you could see that there's oil sheens and, you know, other things, floating debris, things that are completely unnatural and show up highly polluted. But as the river system starts to recover because of abatement of pollution, you can see that the signs, the visual signs of pollution start to go away. But in some cases, they're still sporadic, you know, as like the Canary Bay website, site where Mike, you were talking about earlier, or was it Greg? I can't remember. How there were sporadic instances of fires breaking out. So you don't see it all the time, but sometimes you see that there's a problem. Then you get to the stage where everything looks okay, but it's not actually, because you see that fish are still having tumors and other biological effects that aren't good. The fish are there, but they're not healthy. So now we're in the stage here where we're between these two. Now the obvious signs of legacy contaminants are gone. But knowledge and awareness of environmental quality has put us in a good position to understand and address the impacts that remain. So the now what question is what we have to answer. So we have to make sure in this stage of the recovery that we don't digress a little bit, because we're moving from here to here because of all the efforts that have been done collectively over the years. But at the same time, we have new and emerging chemicals of concern, some that are not even being measured. But we know from a global perspective that they are a problem, like microplastics, for example. And we don't have that information to say whether that's a problem or not here yet. Maybe it isn't now, but maybe it's on its way. So we have to make sure that we don't digress a little bit. And, you know, some of those things, it's not going to be necessarily that we end up with this stage again. We may end up with a situation here where we're seeing toxicity to organisms and we don't understand why, because there's new contaminants coming in. So I think the message is not to become complacent, and this is why university-based research in particular is so very important. So I'm going to hand it back to Lisa.
Question,
Yeah.
do you test for pharmaceuticals?
Oh, we don't test for pharmaceuticals now. I don't think that's been tested at all in any studies so far.
It's needed. I would say it's needed.
We
Yeah.
did test it, we had a project maybe 4 years ago that was fashion free and was St. Mary's through outflow. And it was, we could detect DEET, albuterol I think it was, which I think is an asthma drug, and acetaminophen. And I'm trying to think if there's one other that was a surprise. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely things that were detectable. Now, we don't know, a lot of those things we don't understand how that's impairing the biological communities yet.
Sure.
But that's the only, I think, testing that I'm aware of.
Thanks.
Good question.
Okay, so just a few more slides. Basically showing you where we are in terms of the St. Mary's River AOC and those beneficial use impairments. So the original 10 beneficial use impairments for the St. Mary's River. So that's are listed here. And some of them have been removed from the list. So for example, bird and animal deformities or reproductive problems no longer impaired. There's two separate columns here, depending in the United States, even though it's a binational river, an area of concern, due to funding, different governments. We still do delist the BUIs separately. However, normally they're pretty close together, right? So, for example, on the American side, the water quality related BUIs, such as eutrophication and undesirable algae, beach closings, and degradation of aesthetics, have been deemed not impaired. And on the Canadian side, due to the water quality study that Paula just went over, as well as a beach closings assessment report, we have put in a recommendation to change those to not impaired as well. And then for the American side, restriction on dredging activities has been recommended to be changed to not impaired. And for the Canadian side, we're still going to work a little bit on creating a sediment management plan and looking at more results for fish tumor studies before we recommend that that's.
Are the criteria the same for both countries?
No, so there's a set of, two different criteria.
Can you generalize the difference between the criteria? one stronger than the other, or not that simple?
It's not that
It's not
simple,
really.
you have to look at them.
So I guess moving forward and some of the next steps. So even though we're looking towards removing some of those water quality related PUIs, we want to make sure that we're not kind of taking a back step, as Paula said, and we want to make sure that we're still going to safeguard those improvements to the water quality. So we want to make sure that there's programs and regulations out there that help keep our water quality in good condition. As far as contaminated sediments, we're going to start working on a contaminated sediment management strategy in Canada. So that will be a multi-agency task, as well as rely heavily on public input, the BPAC involved. For fish contaminants and tumors, there's going to be some research going on that's going to look at the level of contaminants within fish, kind of compare them to fish found within the St. Mary's River AOC to maybe consumption of eggs outside within the Great Lakes, as well as perhaps doing another follow-up fish tumor study, because again, we haven't reached that 5% threshold that we wanted to. And then doing some more work for habitat. So a good example, probably in the upcoming year, we'll be working with Binational First Nation, who will be constructing islands and shoals off of whitefish to naturalize channel bed and bank areas to create fish habitat. So those are just some of the next steps that we'll be involved in. And there are lots of opportunities for engagement. So public participation is very important. Just talk very quickly here about the Binational Public Advisory Council, which you've heard a little bit about already. This council was formed in 1988, and it provides informed and continuous public participation in the Remedial Action Plan process. So the BPAC is made up of citizens from both sides of the border, and its role is to inform agencies involved in implementing the Remedial Action Plan about public views and opinions regarding cleanup of the area of concern. So the group does try to meet monthly, so 1 month we'll meet here at Lake State University, and the next month we'll meet at Algoma University, and it's open to the public, so everyone's encouraged to attend if you're interested. We do a lot of public outreach events. Educating the public about water quality is really important. So we like to also go to schools and try to educate some of the youth and younger people out there about water quality. We have a website as well as a Facebook page. So I do have a table set up out in the front if you're interested in picking up some information about that, please do so. As well as I have a sign-up sheet, so if you're interested in being part of our distribution list for the BPAC, or email distribution list, I can send you updates about when those meetings are going to take place and some of the activities that are going on. And just some closing remarks. So our environment is connected by water, right? So our rivers, streams, wetlands, groundwater, they all flow through our communities. We use water for pretty much everything, right? For transportation, we drink it, for fun and recreation. Pardon?
We are it.
We are water, exactly. But it's not unlimited, so we don't want to take it for granted, right? And I guess just in closing, kind of a shout out to some of the members and participants of the Remedial Action Plan program, listed in alphabetical order because everybody is just as important. And I guess I'll open the door to any questions.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I have a cabin in North Channel, Sugar so the east sewage facility. Number one, has that problem been remedied? Number two, what was actually causing the problem? And then what was done to correct it if it has been corrected?
So I think you're probably talking about the instances where people were seeing floating material.
Yes.
And high levels of E. coli in the water.
Yep.
So I think the problem was majorly the East End wastewater treatment plant before it was upgraded in 2006. So since it has been upgraded in 2006, they have to monitor the discharge and effluent into the river. So E. coli levels have been below what they're mandated to be, as well as the Sugar Island Monitoring Work Group did a 2-year study where they were looking at some of the floating material and instances of that. So from that report, they deemed that it had worked after the sediment storage treatment plant had been upgraded.
Okay, I didn't understand that statement. It was almost like you were saying it was happening just because of heavy rain storm or something like that. So by separating this storm sewers, okay, has any incidents occurred, let's say, and we've had heavy rains? Have there been any further incidents? Or?
I think you need somebody from the Sioux City specifically to answer that question and represent them, but I think that they have had overflows, I think, but they have infrastructure in place now to capture it, I believe. And they have addressed that.
I mean, hopefully, I haven't noticed it.
Yeah.
I'm down a lot, so,
Yeah.
yeah. But I did see, I mean, it was like something out of a science fiction magazine or a movie, because I was fishing around Sugar Island sometimes. I encountered
The floating debris.
Squirrel Island was the first place, you know. And then as you went up the river, it became more and more abundant. And you could actually see the path when you got up at the sewage plant. Yeah. But hopefully that's taken care of.
I don't see the Sierra Club on that list.
The Sierra Club? Well, I may have forgotten to do it. I should talk to you actually, because I don't think I've dealt with the Sierra Club. I've only worked with the Remedial for 8 years. So definitely
I just woke up, that's
not. Hopefully I wasn't that boring.
No, that's me, I take noon naps, so that's nothing to do with you. That's everything to do with me.
Any timelines as to when you think we'll finally delist AMC? Within 5 years, maybe?
Oh, I
If
would
it's
say
like
within
good.
5 years.
No?
No, we still have quite far to go, and especially with the contaminated sediments, depending on how that's going to be dealt with. I'm assuming a really long time.
Yeah, I think we'll be in the monitoring stage for quite a while yet. And then because it is binational as well, there's that extra challenge. Definitely the people at all levels of government want to have it delisted as soon as possible. And there's a big push to try and have every BOI that can be delisted taken off. But at the same time, there's due diligence that's being done. So it's not going to happen anytime too soon.
I know this is all water quality. Is there similar work being done monitoring air quality? Because it's disheartening to me to look across the river, look north, and you just see a brown haze often, maybe not every day. And then I fish on the north end of Sugar Island, I look back and I see that same brown haze, which I assume is virtually all from SR. Any work being done on that?
I don't know personally.
I can talk to that a little bit. I don't know specifically for SR. I know that they've hired somebody to deal with air quality. But when I started my PhD many years ago now, water quality was a big thing, and there still was so much that was unknown in terms of even how to measure some of the contaminants in water. And then the policy was just trying to catch up to the science. So there was a lot that happened in terms of, trying to figure out how to best quantify things and then how to move that into policy and remediate things like this, right? And especially to put limits for industrial effluent. Air is that problem right now that was for water before. So water came a long way in terms of science and policy, but air is still behind. So they're putting a big push on right now. Like I think
both all levels of government, you know, I was thinking from the Canadian side only, but they're trying to move the science forward and then try and, you know, obviously there has to be, if they tighten the environmental regulations in terms of what an industry can put out into the air, they need to have the engineering capacity to make those changes. You can't tell industry that it has to be within a certain low limit, but then there's no technology anywhere in the world that they can achieve that, right? So it's a combination of things, but I think there's good things that are coming. It might take a while, right?
Well, I can speak a little bit to the water. I grew up in part on Sugar Island, essentially straight across the river from the East End sewage treatment plant on the Canadian side. It was before the plant was there. The effluent pollution, we always called it Abitibi. I don't know if that was just a false, you know, St. Mary's paper. Wood chips floating, a brown scum. Nobody would want to swim in it. And now it's just so much nicer. I'm talking 60 years ago. But yeah, it's been a big change in what I can see at least.
I think those are the kind of perspectives that we lose too, right? You know, people don't come out and talk about those stories because everyone looks at the river now and thinks, you know, it's perfectly clean, and it is. It's come such a long way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and we'll be meeting back in here for the final session, and hopefully you'll all people come back, and thank you very much.